Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. Joel Muddamalle, who is the Director of Theology and Research for Proverbs 31 Ministries. He also has a Ph.D. in the New Testament under Drs. Patrick Schreiner and Michael Heiser, with an emphasis on Paul's household language in Ephesians, which is the foundation of our conversation today. We began talking about the end of Ephesians, where Paul uses household language to describe the multi-ethnic kingdom of God that he is forming. And we go back into the Old Testament roots of that passage, and that spills over into a conversation about what it means to be a multi-ethnic church. And then we end with a conversation about who is the better all-time basketball player, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. So come for the theology, stay for the basketball. Please welcome to the show for the first time, Dr. Joel Muddamalle. Joel, we've been connecting offline for a bit now, and finally we are here on the podcast. So thanks for coming on Theology in the Raw.
Thanks, Preston. Super excited to be on here.
Give us just a quick background of who you are, how you got into scholarship, your journey, and kind of what you're up to these days.
For me, my journey, if you can hear me, you might not be able to tell, but if you see me, I'm Indian. And so my grandparents are missionaries in India. Some of my earliest memories are of my grandfather preaching the gospel in India in rural villages with a class of people called Untouchables. So really, I think blessed to be able to have a strong heritage in the faith and seeing the gospel at play, in my life. And so part of just my journey has been trying to figure out what God wants of me and how I relate in different places. I've always felt like I never really quite fit in. I have a joke when I was born in the Chicagoland area. So I grew up watching Michael Jordan win the three-peat, repeat the three-peat. An incredible time to grow up in the city of Chicago. And really, it begged the question, like, where do I belong? Where do I fit in? And do I have a place to fit in? And I found that the church really was the place where I felt welcomed. It was the place where I was seen in some ways. There were parts of me that were seen. It's real complicated. Parts of me were seen, other parts of me were not seen, and just kind of led me down a road of what does the Bible actually say about my ethnicity? What does the Bible say about Joel as an Indian who is a child of an immigrant that was born in the States but lived the first 2.5 years in India and then came back? All of those questions. And so I ended up going to Bible college. I'm a theological mutt. I did an undergraduate degree at a Pentecostal charismatic Bible college in Sacramento, California. I went to go work for Logos Bible Software. And while I was working for them, I ended up going to seminary at Knox Theological Seminary, which is a Presbyterian spot. I have done the gamut of the theological world. I think I just need to go the Anglican route, and then I will hit everything. Yeah, the Ph.D. was at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so underneath Drs. Patrick Schreiner, who's my first reader, and then my second reader is Dr. Michael Heiser, who's an Old Testament scholar. And I did my dissertation, kind of my journey. My dissertation was on Paul's household themes in Ephesians, primarily looking at the oikos terminology. And, most like commentaries are going to say, well, Paul's drawing from a Greco-Roman background, and you've got Temple of Artemis and all this stuff that's taking place. And I kind of had this suspicion. I think Paul's a really good Jewish boy, and he understands his Old Testament. Is there more to it? And that's where Heiser was super helpful for me of really seeing that in Ephesians, Paul actually, I think, is drawing from the Babel narrative, and then also a Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which I would say Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 is the aftermath of what takes place of the consequence in Genesis 11 with Babel. As I was taking a look at Ephesians 2, 18-22, and kind of Paul's language of the foreigners coming in and this construction of this living temple, I kind of was like, man, where is he drawing this imagery, this architectural imagery, the language, where is this coming from? A lot of commentaries when we're reading, initially, it's all talking about a Greco-Roman kind of background. Interestingly, I think it was Marcus Bart was like the only person I found in my lit review that has this like little passing sentence. It's like, and Paul's got Babel as a background, and then he moves right on from it. And I was like, wait a minute, I think there's more to this. When did there first become a Jew-Gentile distinction? what is the actual roots of this text? And for me, I really found it in Genesis 11. And I looked at Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, and then Genesis 12, which is obviously the Abrahamic covenant. And really, Dr. Heiser really helped me kind of fill in some gaps, because typically, like, we're reading Genesis 10, 11, and 12 and kind of just moving on. But the aftermath, the consequence of Genesis 11, the tongues are diversified, all the people kind of spread out. It actually has Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, the sons of God that were allotted to the nations. There's a disinheritance of Yahweh of the nations, and then he keeps Jacob as his allotment. And so really, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 is the aftermath of Genesis 11, and this is the Jew-Gentile distinction. This is where we get the gods of the nations in the Old Testament. And so for me, it was kind of like, wait a minute, I actually think Paul is drawing from Babel as a background text, and he's got this Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 worldview that's in play, because he's got the language of the powers and the principalities and the authorities. So there's this cosmic reality that's taking place that involves both God's human family as well as these supernatural beings that are present. And so these are interrelated and interconnected, not separated and demarcated, which I think often, at least in my context, we try to keep those in their tight, neat little corners.
Yeah. The supernatural beings, it makes me think of Ephesians 3:10, that kind of climactic moment where Paul's been talking about Jew-Gentile stuff now for 2 chapters at least. I would even go back at the end of chapter 1, the fullness of God. But chapter 2 for sure, and then into chapter 3, Paul talking about his specific mission to the Gentiles, and it comes to this climactic moment so that the wisdom of God might be manifested.
The multifaceted wisdom of God. Yeah. And the word multifaceted is the same word that's used in the Septuagint of Joseph's robe of many colors. It's got this concept of the ethnicities of the world. It's a multi-flowered kind of ideology that's present there as well. I mean, it's all over the place, Preston. It's in Ephesians 1, 20 through 21. This is the ascension. This is a lot of Schreiner's work, It says that Christ was raised far above every ruler, authority, power, and dominion over every title given, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. And he subjected everything under his feet. And then in 2:1, according to the ruler of the power of the air. So before we even get into the building of this beautiful temple in Ephesians 2, we get this scene that's being established of this cosmic reality. And what are these supernatural beings aimed at? They're aimed at disrupting and creating chaos and division and disunity, and keeping the people of God away from each other and apart. And so when you have the ascension of Christ that brings all of the powers subjected underneath Christ and really disarms the evil powers, then in Ephesians 2, 18 through 22, it's talking about how we are no longer foreigners and strangers. We're fellow citizens. We're members of the oikos tauteo, the household of God. And it's really interesting because it's like, okay, what's happening in Babel in Genesis 11? So Genesis 10, it's everybody's got lands, languages, and cultures. You got the Table of Nations that's present there. This is kind of like my train of thought as everything was going. Then we get to Genesis 11, and it's like, and then there's one language. Well, wait a minute. Do you have many languages or do you have one language? Like, how is this possible? So I'm Indian. In India, the main language is Hindi. There's this concept called the lingua franca, and it's like I'm a Tolkien fan, so it's like the one language to rule them all, the one ring to rule them all. So it's like you can speak Hindi and you can really get around anywhere. But if you go from village to village, they'll have their own dialect. Like they're going to have their own language, and it's very intimate. It's very personal to them. And so I think it's very possible that you have the presence of both diversity and unique cultural expression in Genesis chapter 10, but you also have one common language that's actually knitting all the people together so they can talk and they can, go out about their work and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve. The problem with Genesis 11 is that they go into full-on rebellion. The commission out of Eden is to go out into the ends of the earth, spread the image of God to the ends of the earth. And instead, what they do is they try to build a ziggurat temple tower, And in building this temple tower at the very top, and we've got archaeological evidence of this, at the very top of the temple would have been a chamber, a room for the deity to come down. And so instead of going out into the world to spread the image of God into the ends of the earth, the people try to force God's hand and force him to come down. It's an act of total rebellion, and they use bricks and mortar, and they try to use human creativity and ingenuity in order to accomplish this task. And as a result, Yahweh is like, nah, like this is not going to happen. And then he comes down and he diversifies their tongues. Now, here's what's interesting. Then where do they go? They go back to what they knew in Genesis 10. They all had a common language and a common tongue. It's like, well, if I can't speak Spanish, if I can't speak Russian, and that was that was the language that connected all of us. Well, I'm going to go back to Hindi. That's the only language. So I'm going to find the other people that speak Hindi, and then that's how they all kind of connect back together. And so there's this diversification that took place. We've got this reversal, but I don't think it's purely a reversal. I actually think it's a redemptive reinstitution at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Because what happens is when the Spirit of God comes down, which again is interesting, right? In Genesis 11, they're trying to force God to come down by their own means. Here in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, the Spirit of God does come down. It's the aim and the ambition, but it's being done as an empowerment, as a fulfillment of prophecy. And when the Spirit comes down, I think it's wild that you've got the list of nations in Acts 2. Well, if you laid them out geographically, this is the same geographical locations that are present in Genesis 10 in the table of nations. So you've got this throwback that's happening. And then on top of it, it's like, man, if I were the Holy Spirit, I really feel like I would be after efficiency and being like quick, being productive. It's a good thing that I'm not the Holy Spirit. It's like, why doesn't the Holy Spirit just use Greek or Aramaic as the language that translates out to everything else? Why is the text so specific in Acts 2 that everybody wondered, they marveled because they heard the gospel in a beautiful way the very first time intimately in their own native tongues, And for me, it was like, man, God cares about their culture. God cares about their ethnicity. That cares about their background. Your ethnicity is not obliterated. When you walk into the family of God, it's actually celebrated. How kind and how gracious of Yahweh to actually see the very first time you would hear the good news of the gospel. It would be in that familial, native, comfortable language that brings back all of these great memories. It's like my wife is white. I'm Indian. Whenever we watch Bollywood videos or movies and something funny happens, and I have the unfortunate task of translating the joke from one language to another, the second I try to, it's not funny. It's not funny anymore, Yeah. And so you have that taking place, and then you get to Ephesians 2, 18 through 22, and this is what Paul's talking about. The dividing wall of hostility is broken down, that we're no longer foreigners and strangers. We're fellow citizens. And now I think it's fascinating. Instead of the temple being built by bricks and mortars, here in Ephesians 2, 18 through 22, the temple is actually being built. It's a living and growing temple. And this living and growing temple is being built. The building blocks are the nations of the world, the ethnos of the world. And I just thought that, man, that is such a beautiful reflection of what's taking place at Babel, and seeing it being reversed, but also redeemed and reinstituted, of going back to the ideal of God, of saying, yes, we have many cultures, we have many nations, we've got many ethnicities, and these things should be celebrated, when you walk into the family of God, not obliterated. So really, this is a grand story of God having his family back together.
So it's, when you say it's not a reversal of Babel, it is a reinstitution of Babel by integrating the different ethnic expressions, languages, rather than those ethnic expressions and languages being a result of the sin of Babel. Or how would...
Exactly. Yeah, okay. Exactly. So I want to see Babel in light of Genesis 10, and saying like, all these people migrate to the plains of Shinar and they want to build a ziggurat temple, but they already had a diversity of languages, but they had one common language. And so the consequence of rebellion at Babel is the loss of the one common language. In Acts 2, you almost regain that connectivity. The Holy Spirit does it, but the Holy Spirit does it through knitting their multi-languages together through an understanding, through common understanding. And then in Ephesians 2, you've got the same architectural kind of language that's taking place. The foreigners, those who are on the outside, come together and they're building the temple. And instead of it being bricks and mortars, it's the nations of the world that are coming together to build this temple. And so you've got this sense that it's not a doing away, but it's actually like a returning to the ideal of how God intended for the nations to live and interact and to be in a relationship with each other, which is messy. It's not clean, and we want it to be clean.
Yeah. Oh, and I want to get to some of the practical stuff because I know you're heavily in, on the leadership of one of the largest multi-ethnic churches in America, I believe. A really good one. Well, I'm curious about the image of Babel in particular, because Babel does take on, Babel becomes the place of Babylon, and Babylon is code for Rome and this kind of negative empire. Is that kind of a different conversation from what you're exploring in your dissertation, or does that relate, the kind of negative image that Babel in particular takes on?
Yeah, actually, so then you get to Genesis 12. You get to Genesis 12 with Abraham. Abraham is from Ur of the Chaldeans. He makes a pit stop in Haran, and it's like, well, where is he? So it's like, out of the epicenter, this is the same geographical locations of Babel, So out of the epicenter of rebellion, these people have gone into rebellion. Out of the epicenter of rebellion in Genesis 12, God, in his kindness, he actually picks a family out of the rebellious this place and calls them to himself, calls Abram to himself, and then gives the Abrahamic covenant that all the nations of the world will be blessed through him, And so Babel is the archetype of the enemy, of rebellion, of sin, and yet God steps in and redeem something out of that to be a vision of what the family of God ought to look like.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I don't know, just thinking out loud here, it almost relates the idea in the New Testament of, the church as a multi-ethnic community being almost an alternative polis, an alternative community, an alternative kingdom to, the Babel of the day, the Babylon of the day, namely Rome, kind of like embodying what Babel is supposed to be all along, but failed to do. I don't know if that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like I think it was N.T. Wright uses the language of signposts,
Yeah.
It's like missional outposts, and it's like it's that same idea. We're a visible witness to the already but not yet kingdom of God that gives people a vision of how we ought to live in relationship to each other as image bearers of God. And so, like, and I know this is a lot of the work that you've done, Preston, but it's like, how do we live as sojourners and strangers in a land that is not our own? And yet 2 Corinthians 5, we're faithful ambassadors of the kingdom without buying into Babel as being our home and our hope. And so that requires a lot of work and intentionality, around that. So yeah, I think all of that is taking place.
Nope, you cut out again. Sorry. I'm glad you're recording because I didn't catch the last part, but you sound like Derwin there. I love, his view on kind of the kingdom of God and politics is just so spot on, I think. Well, tell us about, so you've done a lot of theological, biblical spade work on God's heart for a multi-ethnic kingdom. You're also been heavily involved in a church that's trying to live that out. How does that work? I mean, what are some of the what's the messiness? What are some of the huge wins when you pursue a multi-ethnic kind of kingdom? Well, a multi-ethnic church as an expression of the kingdom. What does it look like on the ground?
It's hard. Like, I think sometimes on the outside, it's like, oh man, must be so much fun. Like, this thriving multi-ethnic church, and y'all are crushing it, and Derwin's doing phenomenal work, and he's writing these books. And I get to be a part of the teaching team, and it's a lot of fun. But it's a lot of grind in the sense of, I think it would be nice if it's just like, I don't know, we just woke up one day and everything was perfect. Like everything was growing, that we didn't have challenges, which I think a lot of people would feel like that. But I'm working on a book that releases in 2024. And in it, I have this section where I talk about the George Floyd kind of situation. And as racial injustice has just skyrocketed. Actually, 3 years ago on Thanksgiving, right around Thanksgiving, one of my cousins was on campus at UIC, and she was assaulted and murdered in the parking garage. And I remember that day. I actually called Derwin, and I was like, just devastated. She had left campus. She was off campus that night, helping high school students that wanted to go into like a pre-med program that she was a part of. So she was dressed up in a nice dress, and so she got off at the bus stop, and she walked by a bus stop, and there's a guy there, and he just kind of catcalled her. Now, I've got a sister. I've got a little girl who turned 3 actually today, present on Valentine's Day. And so it's like, what do you do when a guy catcalls you? It's like you ignore him and you just move on. You know, that's kind of like the common idea there. And she did that. She ignored him, moved on. And he took that really negatively and followed her into a parking garage. And it just like our world changed. You know, it actually made the news. It was pretty bad. But I remember calling Derwin and just sobbing, and he was just pastoring me through it. And then the thing that I said to him was, one of the the other tragic aspect of it is the man that murdered her was Black. And so a lot of times racism or racial kind of tension is left in the conversation between Black and white. And I, as an Indian, I'm just going to say, well, that's not true. There's actually racial tension between the Black and Indian communities, between the Latino and Black communities. And so for Indians, the way that it's kind of played out, and I'm not going to say it for everybody, I can just say for my experience personally, the way that played out is like, man, we don't want to get into the racial discussion, the racial talk, because then we might be implicit in it. We might get caught up in this mess. So it's better to just keep quiet, you know, and let them figure out their stuff. And I just remember talking to Derwin that day about this and just talking about how this type of situation reinforces that ideology, you know, and that horror. And so sitting in a small group at TC where we've got multiple ethnicities, multiple people that are mixed race. My kids are half Indian and half white. And having to navigate through that. What does that look like? How do we move past this? And how is it possible for the good news of the gospel of Jesus, the Messiah, who, you know, we talked about Ephesians 2, who broke down the dividing wall of hostility, for us to overcome something like this and to move past it. And not really that we move past it, but we move forward into the hope that Jesus can knit us still together. And so it's been messy. It's been messy as we've navigated that. Another example is sitting in a small group, and we're I remember one of my friends, he's Black, and he was like, man, I had to have the talk the other day. And we're all in a big group, right? And it was just kind of funny. And I was like, I kind of instantly knew what he was talking about. And a couple of the white dads were like, oh no, like, how'd you guys do like the birds and the bees? You know, like that's a lot. And my buddy was like, what? He was like, nah, bro. Like, we already had that a long time ago. I'm talking about when the cops pull you over. And they were like, what are you? And this is messy. You know, this is the part of discipleship. And I think Paul's language of one another, there's a reciprocity of relationship that says, listen, I have to, like, my responsibility as a lover of Jesus and as a brother or sister in Christ is to invite you into my story. So that as I invite you into my story actually takes root into your life so that you can relate to it in a way that if I didn't invite you, it would be foreign to you, you know? And so he kind of walked through like why it's so important for him to teach his son, like, what do you do when a police officer pulls you over, and what are the things you want to be thinking about, and what are the things you don't want to do, and just the realities of that. And then I explained to them, you know, I've got 3 boys that are all different shades of brown. You know, my oldest is super light, my middle son is darker, and my youngest son, my mom calls her her Indian baby, you know, because he's super dark like me. And I'm like, man, in that situation, each of them have different responses and different ways to kind of think about that. It just gets more complex. And it was one of the most beautiful scenes. These two dads who are white, they were just in tears, absolute tears. And we're like, hey, is everything okay? Like, what's going on? And they go, we finally realized that we have to have the talk. And I was like, what are you talking about? You have to have the talk. Like, that's kind of odd. I wasn't even thinking through the implication. And he goes, like, our sons are friends with your sons. What if they're in the car with them? Like, how should they and I was just like, wow, this is the family of God working through some really messy and difficult conversations, but the power of one another. If I can invite you into the reality of my story and allow you to see like, where are the things that are really painful but also hopeful, and then hear from you as you process through it, I think it's a really, really beautiful thing that builds out of it. And that's the journey that I've had at TC. That's the journey I think that we're walking through. Is it's not quick by any means, but like in the words of Eugene Peterson, it's really a long obedience. It's an endurance towards the direction of Jesus, that we want to partner with our brothers and sisters of different ethnicities, and including gender. This isn't just of ethnic or culture. I'm talking about even women as well, and the challenges in our society that have come up in regard to that. And so it's been a journey for sure.
This episode is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. Look, life can be super challenging, filled with ups and downs, times of joy and times of sorrow. And so it's important for us to be spiritually and mentally healthy. Faithful Counseling will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist who's a practicing Christian. This isn't a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional counseling done securely online. So you can log into your account anytime and send a message to your counselor. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions, so you don't have to be on camera if you don't want to. Faithful Counseling is more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is available. We all need to talk to somebody, and Faithful Counseling can help. You can go to the website and read the testimonials. For instance, I read one reviewer who said that his counselor is, quote, a great counselor that truly listens. He gives you the space to talk through your emotions and provides concrete solutions and action steps to help you improve your mental health. So visit faithfulcounseling.com/theology and get the professional faith-based counseling that you deserve. Theology and our listeners will get 10% off your first month by going to faithfulcounseling.com/theology. We got about 3 teenage daughters, and I feel like it's been such a learning curve for me, just taking for granted. I mean, this is similar to some of the race conversations you're talking about, like taking for granted my individual experience in society and not recognizing that not everybody has the same liberties or freedoms or privileges or whatever term you want to use by virtue of, my identity as a white man. For instance, I've never thought about my safety going on a long run. It's a hot day out. I'll go out, take my shirt off, just got, my shorts on. I'll run anywhere. I remember running in, this might not have been the wisest, but in downtown Kathmandu in Nepal. I was on jet lag, got up at 4 a.m, pitch black out, and I was running through the town. It was brilliant. It was so much fun. And like, you talk to women, they're like, no, every time I go on a run, I'm deeply thinking about my safety. I can't run there. I can't wear this, can't do that, can't. There's so many things to think about before I just go on a run, because I don't have the freedom of just going out with my shirt off, or sports bra and yoga pants or whatever. Like I couldn't go in a dark city, like in the middle of late morning, is going a long run without even just with my headphones in. Like, no, I can't do that. Like, that's not a thing. That's a minor example, but just, you don't, if you just live in an echo chamber, or people that just look and act like you, or just don't even ask good questions, you don't recognize the beautiful complexity of the diverse experiences that people have. This is kind of how I'm processing it. I'm curious for you, with the race conversation, what as an Indian American, what are some unique forms of I don't know, prejudice or even racism that you experience that maybe even people of other ethnicities don't experience? I don't think I've ever asked anybody that before.
Yeah, I have some of this stuff. I'm actually, it's funny that you asked that. I'm writing some of this stuff down, and part of this, like, Preston, I realized like I was traumatized as a kid. I didn't even know that it was trauma. Like I was like, I'm going through therapy right now. Like I've been going through therapy for a while. I get to do this podcast series called Therapy and Theology with the licensed therapist, and it's super fun. And halfway through, I'm like, man, I need to really unpack these parts of my childhood that I didn't realize were so significant. So here's one of them. I grew up in Chicago. I love playing basketball, and all of my friends were either black or Latino at this time. Like we lived in this area that was like closer to the hood. And so I went out, and it's like, I'm Indian. Like I'm short, dude. I've got everything going against me at this point. So I gotta have mad handles. So I'm like, listen, I'm gonna perfect this behind the back like crossover thing, and the worst feelings to be the last one picked on the court. And it happened to me all the time. I'm like, I've got to figure this out. So I remember going out there, and I perfected this behind the back crossover, and these kids were out there, and I crossed this kid over, and it was awesome. It was like slow motion, and you just feel like you're Michael Jordan just crushing it. And all of a sudden I heard to the side, like, just, it was almost like slow motion too. I heard this yell, and somebody yelled, "Yo, the Hindu crossed you over." And I was like, who's the Hindu? And I kind of looked around trying to figure out who, and then I realized like they're talking about me. So there's no understanding that Hinduism is a religion, that all Indians are not Hindu, that there's actually different types of Indians that have different types of like I literally just got labeled. And the thing is at that point I was just like, I didn't know what to say. And if I tried to defend myself, I might get beat up. So I'm not trying to get beat up out here. So what do? You go with it. You just go with it.
Oh,
For the rest of that year, my nickname was Hindu. I wore it like a badge around, without realizing that deep inside that it actually was a traumatic kind of experience for me, because I'm not Hindu. I'm a Christian. And so like that's just one example. The other one is like The Simpsons. The Simpsons was like a really challenging show, I think, for a lot of Indians, because it's like, well, everybody, if you're like, I used to get asked all the time, "Hey, Joel, can we go to your 7-Eleven and get some free Slurpees?" And I was like, what? Why? And then I realized, and they'd be like, Apu owns a 7-Eleven, and all Indians work at a 7-Eleven. And so I had to figure out how to recover from that. So I used to make fun of people or joke around it. I'd be like, hey, just to let you know, the guy who's working at the 7-Eleven right now, the Indian guy, he's actually a pre-med student. He was a doctor in India, and he's trying to bring his family over here. So he's actually a medical doctor working at 7-Eleven. You might want to be careful, because when you have a heart attack, he's going to be the guy that's doing open heart surgery on you. But it's like, those were the types of things that I kind of personally just experienced growing up, that I just that was challenging. It was a type of racism. It was a type of prejudice, ideology that for me, it was just like, I got to get over it. I got to get through it. And so, which also, honestly, as a confession, Preston, it also made me a bit complicit through omission when I saw other issues of racism, that were taking place. Because and remember, we talked earlier of like this fear in, I think, the Indian community, like, keep quiet or it's gonna come back on us. And it was some of that, like, man, as long as they're making fun of the Latino kid, or if they're being mean towards this other group of people, if I'm in the clear, then it's okay.
yeah.
And that was challenging.
And I bet, yeah, because so many of the race conversations don't really involve specifically Indian people, unless you're under the broad umbrella of like people of color or something. So they're the unique cultural / ethnic things that Indian Americans bring to the table. I would imagine would be kind of just left out of the discussion often, which I bet that's difficult, or the assumption that well, they're all higher socioeconomic status, generally, so they're probably fine or whatever. But like that doesn't, I don't know. I'm thinking out loud like that I could see where maybe your unique experience would be kind of left behind in the race conversations, which is unfortunate.
And you actually nailed it even there. Like, I think with a lot of different conversations, there's place for middle ground, but you just described it. You're either like a doctor and an engineer and you're crushing it, or you work at the 7-Eleven.
Right.
Like there's, you own a gas station, and it's like there's no like middle ground or nuance to the conversation. I remember I was asked to be a host of this kind of conversation on racial kind of injustice stuff, and I went out to dinner with these guys that were speaking, and in the conversation somebody had just said, because it was like a black and white situation, about I think we were talking about reparation. I mean, all kinds of stuff that night. And at one point, one of the guys looked at me and goes, "Yeah, but this doesn't involve you, Joel. Yeah, in fact, it's like we got to keep the Latinos and Indians out of this conversation because it's not their issues." And I just remember thinking like, "Oof, that's tough. That's a tough statement for somebody to make, or even to make to me, because I'm like, I wrote a dissertation that like at a scholarly level, but really at a practical level of saying, listen, the heartbeat of God's ideal for his family is reunification, is reunion without the loss of your ethnic distinctives, and it's like I'm trying to champion and be here and be a supporting voice, but then when you're like, yeah, it doesn't involve you, like it's better for you to just be quiet and not be involved in this discussion. It's almost like, man, that's a tough pill to swallow, because like I just got uninvited from a discussion that if it's not dealing with me today, it could deal with me tomorrow, like here's another simple one, Preston. When I was traveling a lot in the airport, and I like don't share this often, but I was traveling a lot. And at this point I didn't have TSA pre-check, which I do now. Thank God. I love TSA pre-check. But I could tell you and I have my beard out like pretty good right now. If my beard was out and if I made the intentional decision not to talk, if I was just quiet and sitting in line, I could almost tell you when the random check was going to come my way, and then I would test it and I'd be like, well, I'm going to have like a nice beard that's like trimmed down, and I'm going to be really intentional of talking in line so that the gate, like TSA agents, they can all hear me, and it was amazing how the random checks were much less. And this is around the time, post 9/11, all of that taking place. And so there's all kinds of complexity with that. But even that's a unique kind of, that was an experience of walking through that. That was challenging.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, I was gonna ask. I was wondering about when you mentioned earlier about traveling so much. If that's been an issue at all. You should just grow it out really long and wear a turban or something and just mess with people. Eat some spicy food, get all sweaty, and just see how many times. Yeah. Oh man. That's super helpful, man. Yeah. What are so being part of a actually, here's one more question along those lines. As a mixed race couple, you and your wife, does that also present, what are there any unique challenges with that? I know it's becoming more common. I'm so thankful for that. I think I can't wait to see what America looks like in 30, 40 years, Yeah, what are some unique challenges there?
I mean, my goodness, that's like a whole different podcast. That's a whole different episode, conversation of itself. My wife has a funny, it's not even funny, it's just legitimate now, is Instagram handle called Almost Indian Wife. And so she just jokes like, it's like she's almost Indian. She's working her way towards full acceptance there. But some of the things have just been cultural acceptance on her part. What is accepted or expected of her as a white woman who married into an Indian family, and kind of the culture there. But some of it is just like, and I think you've probably heard this a lot of places, it's like the way that she gets looked at sometimes when she's with the kids in Target. It's like, are you the nanny? Oh, those kids are so cute, are they yours? Like, did you adopt? Like just stuff like that where you're like, no, I birthed all four of these children, are mine, and I birthed them. And so that's been challenging. But honestly, the one that has been the most difficult, which we didn't expect, is for my children, my boys. We've got 3 boys, 12, 10, and 8, and then a little girl who's 3. It's how they identify themselves. So I remember one day, my youngest son comes into the house and he's mad, he's frustrated, And I'm like, Luke, what's going on? Is everything okay? And he just looked at me. He goes, if anybody asks, I'm Indian. And I was like, "What? Like, dude, what's going on?" And I guess like he got tired of like beginning of school always having to say, "I'm half Indian, I'm half white, I'm half Indian, I'm half." And so finally he's darker skinned. So for him, it was just like it caused way too many questions to say, "Well, my mom's white and my dad's in like all of that." So he's just like, "I'm Indian." That's. And for my wife, it kind of made her feel a certain way because she's like, "Well, wait a minute, you're
Hmm.
also like half white." And for me, like, I was like, yeah, and my oldest son is much lighter and he's got a different experience with that. And so, of navigating like their mixed identity and seeing both things as these beautiful aspects of what makes them unique and special and still fully in the image of God, and to be able to have the language to be able to dialogue that with their friends that are at these age groups is, there's no parenting class that got us ready for any of this. So those are kind of things that we've just been walking through. But again, one of the greatest things for us is that we're part of a community like at TC, where this is not unique, this is not novel to us. Like one of our closest friends, she's Latina and her husband's black. And so even with their daughter's hair and navigating through that, and expressions of that, like we've got a community that's around us where we just feel like, man, we're not at this alone. We're in this together. And our kids have found that solidarity, which I think is super special to be able to have that within the family of God and say, like, this is how it ought to be, which sets the trajectory for how they relate to the world. And it's a witness of invitation, like these are things that I think the world longs for. And we just want to present it to them so they can see that they're invited to take part of the beauty of what it means to be part of the multi ethnic family of God.
I mean, I love that you, your family, your kids all have your Christian identity is rooted in a community that's very multi-ethnic. I think it'd be extra hard, right, if the Christian community was, very mono-ethnic, monochromatic. But that's a yeah, that's got to be at a really encouraging piece. Can you, we mentioned your church, Transformation Church. Can you, for those who don't know the church, tell us how big it is and maybe how many? Not that that's the only question we need to ask, but just to get a picture of the community and how many different ethnicities are represented there.
Oh my gosh, I don't even know what the current numbers are, but I mean, it's like I just what Britt and I often say is when we walk into church on Sunday, it feels like the kingdom of God. Literally, it feels like Revelation, like every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so we've got multiple, and then it's also multi-generational press, and that's another massive part of this discussion that we don't often, talk about as much. But it's like not only is it multi-ethnic, but it's multi-generational. It's the wisdom of the saints that is present in discipleship that is so important for us. As my wife and I, as young parents, so that's taking place. TC is, gosh, I think I have to get the current numbers from Derwin, but we're over 3,500, in attendance, 3 services. It's growing. We're looking at multiple campuses at this point to see where we might be able to plant next. Derwin has an incredible conference called actually it's called the Multiethnic Table. It used to be called the Round Table, but it's excellent where he kind of brings in, and if you're a church pastor, a planter, and you want to kind of see how does this happen, like how do we intentionally build not only a church culture but a staff, and from a ministry methodology standpoint, how does this look to have multi-ethnic theology played and fleshed out like on the ground. It's a really great time where our staff actually comes in and does the teaching, and we get to kind of walk through it. I think worship is some of the best. We have multi-ethnic worship that's included in that. And so it's a lot of fun. It's been fun to see Derwin be able, and Derwin's wife is white. He's a former NFL football player, and he's just a sharp dude, a doctoral student from Northern Seminary underneath Scott McKnight. I mean, just he's a sharp guy. And I've got some reformed roots, and he's consistently trying to convince me to buy into corporate elections. So that's an ongoing discussion in our.
I'll be out there in a few months, April, May, I think last Sunday in April or first Sunday in May. So yeah, super excited. Been a fan from a distance, and I mean Derwin's been kind of like you said, just kind of a mentor. Well, at first a mentor from a distance, a pastor from a distance, and now you get to be actually under him. But yeah, just such a gosh, I just can't speak more highly of the guy. He came out, spoke at our conference last year at the Exiles in Babylon, and just oh man, him and his wife came out. It was good seeing both of them, and golly, it's just an incredible man of God. One of those guys that he'll make time if I'm ever. I mean, last summer we're just going through stuff as a family, as a wife and I, and just yeah, asked for some advice on some things, and just immediately, both him and his wife made time for us, and just yeah, incredible. So I
Yeah, the
don't
thing
know.
I'll say.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the thing I say about Derwin, and also my boss Lysa TerKeurst, who I work for. They're both better people off stage than they are on stage. They truly are better people off stage than they are even on stage, which is just a refreshing thing. And Derwin, that's the testimony of him. He's just a call away, and lots of tears together. And lots of debates, because he keeps trying to tell me that LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time. And I'm like, dude,
Really, more than Jordan.
oh yeah, yeah. But then he'll be like, why do we have to? This is what he'll say, man. Why do we have to even compare the two? Why can't we let greatness live as greatness? And I usually respond, that's what people who can't make the argument that LeBron is the greatest typically say, but it's just a fun little thing. He's also an Android guy. I'm an iPhone guy. It's like our relationship itself is the remarkable grace of God that we can be knit together the way that we are.
So what? Okay, I don't follow basketball at all. I follow baseball. It's kind of the only sport I follow. So no, hardly anything about basketball. But grew up like you, 80s, 90s. Jordan was king of the universe. And I just recently watched a documentary which was incredible. So obviously LeBron just broke the all-time scoring record. Um, yeah, and he played. I mean, he played long. I think Jordan still has the most points per game. Is that like the if you take the average? I think
Yeah,
he's
I mean,
or
yeah, I mean, this is where all the debate comes in. It's like, LeBron comes straight from high school in there. Jordan plays college. LeBron's longevity is absolutely like unmatched. And I'm going to try to be like, I do not want to be dishonest in any way, Preston. So like, I want my theology to be honest. I want my scholarship to be honest. I want my passion of basketball and MJ to be honest. And so here's the one thing that I'm going to say honestly. That might push LeBron over MJ in my view. If LeBron actually plays with Bronny, like in the NBA together with his son in the NBA together, and he's still even half of like the output of what he's producing, that is spectacular. That might that might do it for me. But in terms of pure stats, I mean, MJ 6 championships. I mean, it's just 2 3-peats. Never saw game 6 in his entire career. Never had to leave. We don't talk about the Wizards situation. That's just that's like not canonical in my mind. But it's like LeBron had to leave Cleveland to go win his first chip and be with the all-star like team. So, anyways, but LeBron's a great basketball player.
I mean, just it's hard to measure, but again, I'm way outside my area. But you take just the sheer dominance that Jordan had in his to just take the 90s or something, or even late 80s, but like just in terms of being a player that was kind of head and shoulders all around better than anybody else at the time. And maybe would LeBron have the same, or is that where it kind of differs? Where Michael Jordan was just this kind of almost superhuman player when you take him at his best. I mean, just absolutely dominating. And again, I don't. Does LeBron have that same? And is this where the argument is? Like, well, yes, but just not to the same magnitude as MJ. Is that?
Yeah, I think LeBron built on the foundation of MJ, and he does. But also the rules are totally different. You have the hand check rule for MJ. Homeboy scoring 100 points a game. Like off the free throw, like it's insane. MJ had to, the brutality of playing basketball, the physicality of it was totally different from what it is today. So, I mean, you might even argue, I would make the argument that longevity played a part of MJ's career. He just took a beating. The Bad Boy Pistons just destroyed him in his body, which is why he had to bulk up towards that first three-peat. But the other thing too is take a look at who Jordan dethrones. Larry Bird, Magic Johnson. I mean, the only reason Hakeem Olajuwon ever wins a chip is because Jordan retired for 2 years. That was like the only option for those guys. Patrick Ewing. Like, you take a look at these behemoths that in any other era by themselves, they're winning. They're legitimately competing and winning championships. But for those seasons, Jordan not only like knocked them out, but didn't even allow them to play in the same playground as him, versus LeBron. I mean, you just never know what's going to happen, if he's going to show up or not. Is he a clutch player or not? So I think it's a little bit, it's difficult to compare the two, but yeah, the time period that MJ played in was unique.
What's Derwin's argument that LeBron it's at the longevity? I mean, he's got the record. He's
longevity, stats. He's got the record, which obviously stats can be interpreted any way you want, and it's on your side when you play for as many years as he had. But also, I think I think from a physicality standpoint, I would give this to LeBron. Physicality, I mean, he is unmatched. Like, he's downhill finisher, the best all time, without a doubt. So all of that. And I mean, if we were to get ethical as well in this conversation, like if we're going to go on court, off court, I mean, you can't compete with what LeBron is doing off court and his philanthropy and the schools and, all the things that he's kind of doing in that era. Some would make the argument though, that in the time and season that MJ was in, it wasn't possible. Like those weren't even realities for him, And so actually him with Nike and the Super Bowl commercial, like there's going to be a movie that comes out about his shoe basically with Phil Knight, which looks amazing. But it's like those become the foundations of what LeBron is able to build off of today.
Yeah, Jordan was a cultural icon that I don't know any athlete ever that has. Oh my gosh, yeah. Did you like the documentary? On that, it was so good. I was sad when it ended. It was so good. Well, we can keep we kind of went different directions, but Joel, man, it was great getting to know you a bit more and hearing about your work. And we didn't even get into maybe I'll have you back on. Both of us are kind of in a journey researching what we think about women in church leadership. I think we come from very similar perspectives and are asking kind of a lot of the same questions, but we'll have to table that for another day. Just love your honesty and your commitment to doing sound exegesis. So yeah, man, thanks for your work, man, and thanks for coming on Theology in the Raw.
I appreciate it. An honor. Thanks, dude.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.
Hey friends, have you been blessed or encouraged or challenged by Theology in the Raw? If so, would you consider joining Theology in the Raw's Patreon community? For as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to a diverse group of Jesus followers who are committed to thinking deeply, loving widely, and having curious conversations with thoughtful people. We have several membership tiers where you can receive premium content. For instance, silver level supporters get to ask and vote on the questions for our monthly Patreon only podcast. They also get to see like written drafts of various projects and books I'm working on, and there's other perks for that tier. Gold level supporters get all of this and access to monthly Zoom chats where we basically blow the doors open on any topic they want to discuss. All of my patrons play a vital role in nurturing the mission of Theology in the Raw. And for me, just personally, interacting with my Patreon supporters has become one of the hidden blessings in this podcast ministry. So you can check out all of the info at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw.